At Westport Regional's arrivals gate, my father waved, a rare smile after 3 years of silence. 10 minutes later, in the subterranean chill of the parking garage, my stepmother slammed her handbag into my shoulder. "You will never touch this company," she whispered. No blood was drawn, but a line was crossed. What she didn't know was that the camera I'd hidden on Pillar B4 saw it all, unlocking a trap that had been a year in the making. My name is Tessa Monroe. The red-eye flight from Denver was a purgatory of recycled air and the low, constant drone of the engines. I hadn't slept. Sleep was a luxury I hadn't been able to afford since the text message arrived 48 hours ago. It was from my father, Rowan. The first direct communication in nearly a year. Just 3 words on the illuminated screen of my phone, stark against the dark mode background. "Come home now." No punctuation, no context, no warmth. It wasn't a request. It was a summons, as clinical and impersonal as a shipping manifest from Halberd Aero Logistics, the company that had been my birthright and was now my battleground for the entire 5-hour flight. I'd stared out at the blanket of clouds obscuring the world below, my mind a cold engine processing variables and outcomes. I wasn't coming home for a reunion. I was flying into the final phase of a war I had been waging in secret for 365 days. The moment the automatic doors of the Westport Regional Airport slid open, the air hit me, not with the fresh scent of home, but with the uniquely American airport smell of stale, burnt coffee and the sharp, chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner. It was a smell of transient lives and forced efficiency, and there, standing just beyond the security barrier, was my father. He was thinner than I remembered. The sharp lines of his face softened into a kind of weary resignation. He raised a hand in a hesitant wave, the gesture of a stranger trying to place a familiar face in a crowd. A smile flickered on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, once the sharp blue of a clear winter sky, now looked like faded denim, washed out and worn thin. He was a monument to a past strength, a past self I barely recognized. Behind him, a half step to his left, stood Sabine. She was a vision in white, a stark, tailored wool coat that seemed to repel the airport's grime. Her face was obscured by a pair of oversized black sunglasses that looked more like a shield than an accessory. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a chignon so severe it seemed to be pulling her features taut. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. As I approached, dragging my single carry-on roller bag behind me, she offered only a slight, sharp nod. It was the kind of acknowledgement one gives to a subordinate, a gesture of power, not of welcome. There would be no hug, no pretense of familial warmth. We were long past that. The space between the 3 of us felt charged, a vacuum of unspoken history, the noise of the terminal, the announcements over the intercom, the rolling of 100 suitcase wheels on linoleum, the distant cry of a child, seemed to fade into a dull roar. "Let's take the staff exit. It's faster," Sabine said. Her voice was exactly as I remembered, low, smooth, and utterly devoid of inflection. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. Faster, not easier, not more welcoming, just faster. Rowan flinched almost imperceptibly at her tone but said nothing. He just turned and began to lead the way. His shoulders slightly slumped. We walked past the bustling baggage claims, past the rental car counters with their tired-looking agents, and toward a plain, unmarked metal door. Sabine swiped a keycard, and the lock clicked open with an unnervingly loud sound. The corridor behind the door was a different world. The ambient noise of the terminal was instantly cut off, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the faint, metallic scent of machinery. We were in the airport's guts, a sterile, concrete and steel labyrinth of service passages. Our footsteps echoed. My roller bag's wheels, which had been a low rumble on the terminal floor, were now a harsh clatter against the polished concrete. The elevator at the end of the hall was a brushed steel box, its interior cold and impersonal. As the doors slid shut, sealing us in, the silence was absolute. I watched my father's reflection in the steel. He was staring at the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Sabine stood perfectly still, her posture ramrod straight, her sunglasses still in place, reflecting a distorted fisheye version of me and my father. The descent was swift and silent, a drop into another, deeper level of isolation. The elevator doors opened directly into the underground parking garage. The air was cool and still, heavy with the smell of cold concrete, exhaust fumes, and dampness. The only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system. We were parked in stall B4, a corner spot shielded by a thick, square concrete pillar. The lighting down here was a sickly, greenish yellow, casting long, distorted shadows. It felt less like a parking structure and more like a tomb. Rowan moved to take my bag, but Sabine was quicker. She stepped in front of him, her hand shooting out to grab the handle of my roller. For a split second, I thought it was a gesture of assistance, a bizarre, out-of-character moment of civility. I was wrong. With a fluid, practiced motion, she yanked the bag forward, using its momentum to pull me off balance. In the same motion, she swung her own handbag, a heavy, structured leather tote that might as well have been a brick, and slammed it hard into my shoulder, right at the collarbone. The impact was a dull, sickening thud. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, a burst of heat that radiated down my arm. But more than the pain, it was the sheer, calculated violence of the act that stole my breath. It was an assault stripped of all emotion, executed with the cold precision of a business transaction. Her face was close to mine now, the black lenses of her glasses like two dark voids. Her voice was a low, venomous hiss, for my ears only. "Don't be naive, Tessa. The board is done. You have nothing." I saw my father out of the corner of my eye. He winced, a sharp, pained expression contorting his face for a single, fleeting moment. His jaw tightened, but then, as if a switch had been flipped, the tension drained away, and his eyes dropped to the oil-stained concrete floor. He looked away. It was a familiar gesture, a reflex honed over years of surrender. He was a good man who had long ago forgotten how to fight, a king who had willingly abdicated his throne and now simply watched as the new ruler tormented his heir. His silence was a betrayal far deeper than her blow. I took a half-step back, creating space, my shoulders screaming in protest, but I didn't cry out. I didn't flinch. I held her gaze, or the gaze of the black lenses hiding her eyes. My own expression remained neutral, a mask of calm I had perfected. My entire strategy depended on this control, on being underestimated, on being seen as a victim, not a threat. And then I felt it, a silent, targeted vibration against my thigh. My phone, tucked deep in the pocket of my jeans, pulsed twice. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew the notification intimately. I had programmed it myself. On the locked screen, a simple message would be displayed in clean, white text. REC saved. Garage B4. The audio and video file from the microcamera hidden in the defunct sprinkler head directly above us had been successfully recorded and uploaded to a secure off-site server, the final piece of data I needed. I let a small, humorless smile touch my lips. I looked directly at Sabine and pitched my voice just low enough so that only she and my father could hear. "Thank you," I whispered, "for confirming motive." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. It was a micro-expression, a slight tightening around her mouth, but I saw it. She recovered in a heartbeat, her own lips curling into a contemptuous sneer. She dismissed me with a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "The company has no need for an ambitious orphan," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. She turned her back on me, the white coat swinging, and pressed the unlock button on her key fob. The sleek black sedan in the stall beside us chirped obediently, its lights flashing once. The matter, as far as she was concerned, was closed. She had delivered the final, crushing blow. But she was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. As she opened the car door, I reached out and rested my hand on the rough, pockmarked surface of the concrete pillar next to me. My fingers traced the edge of a large patch where the gray paint was peeling away, exposing the raw concrete beneath. The pillar felt cold, solid, and real. This touch, this simple physical act, was a signal to myself. It was the switch being flipped. The plan was no longer theoretical. It was live. The trap, so meticulously designed and baited in the shadows of this very garage, had just been sprung, and the prey, so confident in her own power, had walked right into it. The ride from the airport was a study in absolute silence. I sat in the back of the black sedan, the scent of expensive leather and Sabine's cloying, jasmine-scented perfume filling the enclosed space. Up front, my father drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if the gray ribbon of asphalt held the secrets to the universe. Sabine sat in the passenger seat, a silent, statuesque figure in her white coat, her sunglasses still on. She hadn't spoken a word since her parting shot in the garage. She didn't need to. The silence itself was a weapon, thick with her victory, or what she believed was her victory. I pressed my aching shoulder against the cool glass of the window, watching the familiar drab landscape of Northcrest slide by. Then I saw it. A massive Halberd Aero Logistics truck thundered past us on the highway, the deep blue logo emblazoned on its side, a stylized silver wing cradling a globe. Beneath it, the company motto in clean, confident letters, delivering trust. The irony was so profound, it was almost comical. Trust was the one currency we had stopped trading in years ago. Halberd wasn't just a company. It was supposed to be a legacy, founded by my grandfather, built by my father. It was in my blood, as much a part of my DNA as my brown hair or the shape of my hands. It was the titan that held up the sky over this fictional city of Northcrest, employing half the population and defining its skyline with its sprawling warehouses and gleaming corporate tower. That tower was now Sabine's fortress. I am, on paper, the head of risk for this empire. It's a title that sounds solid, formidable. It implies I am a guardian, a protector of the company's integrity. The reality is that my role had been systematically hollowed out, leaving behind a hard, empty shell. My authority had been neutered, my budget bled dry, my reports buried under layers of corporate bureaucracy meticulously constructed by Sabine. She had no official title other than Mrs. Hale, but within the walls of Halberd, she was the first lady of the company, the shadow CEO, the power behind the throne my father had vacated long ago. My job wasn't to manage risk. It was to be a living, breathing symbol of the old guard, tolerated but kept powerless, a relic to be pointed at as proof of continuity, while the real power was consolidated elsewhere. We pulled up to the main entrance of the Halberd Tower. The sheer glass and steel facade glittered in the afternoon sun, a monument to a success that felt increasingly fraudulent. As we walked through the cavernous marble lobby, I forced myself to look at it. The official family portrait, hung in a place of honor opposite the reception desk. It had been taken last year, at Sabine's insistence. In it, she stands in the center, radiant in an emerald green dress, one perfectly manicured hand resting on my father's arm. Rowan stands beside her, smiling a placid, vacant smile for the camera. And then there's me. I'm on the far edge of the frame, half-turned, as if I were an afterthought, an intern who wandered into the shot by mistake. The overhead lighting catches the side of my face, but the other half is lost in shadow, my expression unreadable. The composition was no accident. It was a message, a public declaration of the new hierarchy. Sabine was the sun, my father the orbiting planet, and I was a distant moon, about to be flung out of the system entirely. That portrait was the public face of the purge. After she and my father married 5 years ago, Sabine began her campaign. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare, waged not with shouting and open conflict, but with quiet dismissals, sudden reorganizations, and smiling assassinations. Loyalists, people who had worked with my father for decades, were the first to go. I remember Frank Peterson, the gruff, brilliant old chief of operations who had taught me how to read a flight manifest when I was 12. He'd questioned one of Sabine's early acquisition proposals, pointing out the inflated valuation of the target company. 2 weeks later, the entire operations division was restructured for greater synergy. Frank was given a generous severance package and a gag order, and a younger, more compliant executive from one of Sabine's former consulting firms took his place. One by one, the old pillars of the company were removed, replaced by supports of her own making. My own attempts to fight back were clumsy and direct at first. I saw the rot starting in our cold chain logistics, our most profitable and sensitive division, handling medical and pharmaceutical shipments. The numbers weren't adding up. I spent 3 months building a case, gathering data that showed inexplicable gaps in our temperature logs and billing discrepancies. I formally proposed a full, independent audit of the entire cold chain network. I presented it in the main boardroom, my voice echoing in the silent, wood-paneled space. When I finished, Sabine, who sat at the head of the table opposite my father, simply smiled. It was a patient, indulgent smile, the kind one gives a precocious child. "Tessa, that's a very ambitious proposal," she'd said, her voice smooth as silk. "But where would we find the money for your little daydreams? Our focus needs to be on forward-looking initiatives, not chasing shadows in the past." The board members, all of them her appointees or men too cowed to challenge her, murmured their assent. My father stared at a knot in the polished mahogany of the table. Silent, I was dismissed. It was shortly after that failed audit that the whispers started. A new, forward-looking initiative called Green Wing. On the surface, it was a brilliant PR move, a fund established to purchase carbon credits, offsetting Halberd's massive carbon footprint. It was a way to make an old-world logistics company look green and modern, but the rumors told a different story. They spoke of a shell company, of vast sums of money being funneled into an entity with no physical address, of tax schemes that bordered on fraud. Anyone who asked too many questions found their career path suddenly diverted. A manager in accounting who tried to trace the initial funding was abruptly transferred to our smallest satellite office in Guam. Greenwing was Sabine's project, and it was untouchable. I'll never forget the day I saw my father sign the final charter document that gave Greenwing its full corporate blessing. I had walked into his office to ask him a question, and he was sitting at his vast desk, the document spread before him. Sabine stood behind him, a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He wasn't reading it. His gaze was fixed on the window, looking out at the city that was once his. His eyes had that look, the one I'd come to dread. They looked like fogged glass on a hot summer day, a barrier between him and the world, obscuring everything. He saw, but he did not see. He picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen, his hand steady, and signed his name. He was signing away a piece of the company's soul, and he did it without blinking. My own exile came a month later. It was framed as a promotion. Sabine announced it herself at a company-wide town hall. I was being made the new head of the entire Pacific Northwest regional hub. Based out of a secondary airport 300 miles away, it was a title bump, a move that looked good on paper. But we both knew what it was. It was a banishment. She was giving me a bigger, more remote sandbox to play in. But she was cutting off my access to the main levers of power at corporate headquarters. She was promoting me with a title while demoting me with geography and a skeleton budget. I was being sent away to wither on the vine. That night, after the announcement, I went back to my empty apartment and made a decision. The direct approach had failed. Open opposition only gave her a target to aim at. From that moment on, I would choose tactical silence. I would accept the transfer. I would play the part of the dutiful daughter, the loyal employee. I would not argue. I would not confront. I would simply watch and listen and collect. The war would move underground. I would become a ghost within the machine. And that brought me to B4, the parking garage. My demotion had given me an unexpected gift: anonymity. No one paid attention to the exiled daughter running a backwater hub. I used that freedom. I bought a cheap, untraceable car for cash. I learned the security patrol schedules for the corporate garage. I discovered the blind spots in the camera coverage. The concrete pillar in stall B4, with its defunct sprinkler head, became my observation post. It was more than just a place to hide a camera. It became my ethics laboratory, a place where I tested the limits of my own resolve, where I weighed the morality of my actions against the necessity of the fight. It was the place where I would prove that Sabine was not just a ruthless executive, but a criminal. Her assault today wasn't an unforeseen complication. It was the final, crucial piece of my experiment, the irrefutable, high-definition proof of her character, delivered by her own hand. My war was not fought in the boardroom with sharp words, but in the silent, glowing world of data, in the digital arteries through which the lifeblood of Halberd Aero Logistics flowed, while Sabine played the queen in her corporate court. I became a ghost in the server rooms, my battlefield a landscape of spreadsheets, security logs, and lines of code. Working from my gilded cage 300 miles away gave me the one thing she couldn't control: obscurity. I was too far away to be a daily thought, and in that space, I went to work. My first move was to weaponize the system against itself. Halberd's cold chain logistics ran on a proprietary tracking software called CryoTrack. It was a beautiful system, one I'd helped design years ago, monitoring thousands of temperature-sensitive shipments in real time. Late one night, fueled by black coffee in my sterile satellite office, I accessed the system's core programming. I didn't hack it. I simply used my old admin privileges that Sabine's IT purges had somehow overlooked. I wrote a simple, elegant script, an anomaly detection layer. It was designed to flag any shipment whose billing code, weight, and declared customs value didn't align with its assigned fuel expenditure and flight duration. And I added one specific tripwire: a keyword alert. I programmed the system to send a silent, encrypted notification directly to my personal device anytime the billing code Greenwing appeared anywhere in the network. For a week, there was nothing. Then, one Tuesday at 3:04 a.m., my burner phone buzzed. A single line of text appeared. Anomaly triggered. Flight HA901. Keyword: Greenwing. On my screen, I pulled up the corresponding graph. Amidst the steady, predictable lines of data, there was a sharp, unnatural spike. It was the first digital trace of the cancer. I knew that simply presenting data wasn't enough. Information had to flow through the correct channels. So, I followed protocol. I compiled my initial findings into a formal risk assessment report, carefully stripping out any mention of Greenwing. I focused only on the statistical improbabilities, the ghost flights that burned fuel with no corresponding cargo weight. It was a document of pure, cold logic. I titled it, Urgent Risk Analysis, Financial Discrepancies in Cold Chain Operations, and submitted it through official channels to the board of directors, knowing it would have to cross Sabine's desk first. A week later, I saw the agenda for the upcoming board meeting. My report was listed near the bottom of the appendix. Sabine had retitled it. It now read, Reference Opinions on Logistical Efficiencies. She hadn't just buried it, she had recontextualized it from a fire alarm into a gentle suggestion. She was gaslighting the entire board with a single font change. The ghost shipments became my obsession. I started cross-referencing everything: pilot rosters, ground crew manifests, even airport catering receipts. I discovered a pattern of weightless shipments. A flight would be officially logged, a flight plan filed. The plane would consume fuel consistent with a heavy load, but the manifest would list 0 CAS. It was a logistical impossibility. A plane flying across the country carrying nothing but its own fuel and a fraudulent invoice. These were the veins through which she was bleeding the company dry, using Halberd's own infrastructure to create phantom transactions for her Greenwing fund. Her counterattack was subtle but swift. A company-wide memo was circulated from Human Resources, a reminder of our policies regarding interdepartmental communication. It was corporate doublespeak at its finest. But the message was clear to those of us who knew how to read between the lines. It was a soft quarantine. Suddenly, my emails to the finance department went unanswered. Old colleagues from headquarters would go quiet if I joined their video call. I was being systematically isolated. My official communication lines severed. I learned of the unofficial directive from a terrified junior analyst who had been a former intern of mine. He forwarded me a screenshot of an internal HR chat. All communications from Tessa Monroe are to be logged and reported. Do not engage directly. Redirect all inquiries to executive management. I was no longer a colleague. I was a person of interest, a contagion to be contained. Since they had cut off the public roads, I built my own secret highway. I created an encrypted, anonymous communication channel and named it Danube 17, after the street my mother grew up on. It was a digital dead drop, accessible only through a series of secure proxies. I sent the access key to a handful of people I still trusted: the grizzled, passed-over lifers on the loading docks, the night shift mechanics, the people who were invisible to Sabine's corporate gaze but saw everything. For weeks, the channel was silent. I started to think it was a mistake, a paranoid delusion. Then, a single message appeared. No greeting, no name, just a photograph. The picture was grainy, taken on a cheap phone in the dim light of a warehouse. It showed a standard wooden shipping pallet, completely empty. Affixed to the side of the pallet was a tamper-proof security seal, the kind we used for high-value pharmaceutical shipments. It was a deep, forest green, and stamped on it in crisp white letters was the Green Wing logo. But the crucial detail was the seal itself. It was perfect, gleaming under the warehouse lights. Without a single scratch or mark on its polished plastic surface, it had never been used, never been broken, never secured anything. It was a prop in a multi-million-dollar play, and I now had the first piece of physical proof. My new life required a new identity, at least a practical one. I drove 2 towns over and paid cash for a 13-year-old, beige sedan, the kind of car that is so profoundly boring it becomes invisible. The paperwork was clean. The title registered to a shell company I'd set up for this very purpose. This car was my ghost. It had no trackers, no electronic toll pass, no connection to Tessa Monroe. It was the key that allowed me to become a physical ghost, too, making regular, unlogged visits to the Halberd corporate campus late at night. My routine became a ritual of stealth and data extraction. Every few nights, I would use a stolen maintenance keycard to access the service corridors and take the cargo elevator down to the garage. The security camera logs for the elevators and garages weren't stored on the main server. They were kept locally on solid-state drives, swapped out by a third-party security team every 30 days, once a week. At 2:17 a.m., a time chosen for its statistical improbability of being witnessed, I would access the maintenance panel, clone the drive's contents onto a palm-sized portable SSD, and be gone in under 5 minutes. Back in my anonymous rented apartment, a custom script would automatically encrypt the data and upload it to a private, triple-redundant server I leased in Iceland. To maintain the illusion of my defeat, I continued to perform my official duties with bland competence. Every quarter, I would submit a risk report to Sabine, as required, but it was a decoy, a document filled with carefully selected, minor operational risks, inefficient fueling procedures at a regional hub, potential for weather delays on a specific route. I made it just detailed enough to look like I was working, but completely toothless. It was a performance, a way of saying, "See? I'm no threat. I'm just a diligent, boring manager." The real report, the one built from anomaly alerts, ghost manifests, anonymous photos, and hours of stolen video footage, went elsewhere. My elsewhere was a carefully chosen, 2-pronged attack vector. The first was a quiet, ferociously brilliant lawyer who represented a consortium of Halberd's minority shareholders, the old families and early investors Sabine had disenfranchised. He was a shark, and my data was blood in the water. The second was a journalist, an investigative reporter for a major aviation trade journal. I didn't like him. He was arrogant and transactional. But he was also ruthless and had a massive platform. I needed his ambition as much as he needed my story. I sent them both the first package, a heavily encrypted file containing the ghost shipment data and the photo of the empty pallet. It was the opening move, the first piece I had placed on the board for the public to see. The war had officially moved out of the shadows. Sabine's first real countermove came not with a whisper, but with the full, crushing weight of Halberd's legal department. I was summoned via a sterile, 3-line email to a conference room on the 40th floor, the domain of the corporate lawyers. The room was all glass and chrome, with a panoramic view of Northcrest that was probably meant to be inspiring but felt like a judgment. Mark Ellison, Halberd's general counsel, and a man whose loyalty to Sabine was absolute, was waiting for me. He didn't smile. He simply slid a 10-page document across the polished obsidian table. "A standard update to our executive confidentiality agreement," he said, his voice flat. It was anything but standard. I read the title, Proprietary Information and Asset Security Non-Disclosure Agreement. It was a legal boa constrictor, its language designed to suffocate. The clauses were absurdly broad, covering not just trade secrets but any information, whether expressed or implied, that could be perceived as detrimental to the company's public image. The penalty for breach was financial ruin, but the real venom was on page 8. Under the heading Corporate Asset Security, it granted the company the right, upon request, to immediately confiscate and perform a full forensic audit on any and all personal electronic devices used by the signatory. It was a phishing license, a legal cudgel designed to intimidate, and it was aimed directly at me. Sabine sensed a leak, and this was her way of plugging it by force. I read every word, my expression impassive. Ellison watched me, his face a mask of professional boredom, but I could see the anticipation in his eyes. He expected me to argue, to refuse, to show my hand. I did none of those things. When I finished, I looked up at him and gave a small, agreeable smile. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own pen. It was a cheap, disposable ballpoint with a clear plastic barrel and a simple blue cap. I clicked it open. "Of course, Mark, anything to protect the company," I said, my voice even. I signed my name, Tessa Monroe, on the signature line with a firm, deliberate stroke. The ink was a bright, defiant blue. It was a habit I'd picked up in business school from a cynical contract law professor. Always sign in blue. Blue ink makes an original document undeniably distinct from a black and white photocopy. It's a small, archaic defense in a digital world, a quiet way of saying, I see the trap, and I'm not afraid of it. It was the act of a person who had been backed into a corner before and had learned how to leave a trail. Ellison seemed almost disappointed by my compliance. "Excellent," he said, collecting the signed document. "Now, as part of the new security protocol, we'll need to do a routine audit on your company-issued laptop. I can have someone from IT collect it now." "No need," I said, already lifting the sleek silver laptop from my bag and placing it on the table. "I brought it with me." He took it without a word. What he didn't know was that he was now in possession of the cleanest laptop in the history of corporate America. I had spent the previous week meticulously building that decoy. Its hard drive contained a perfect, plausible digital life. Work projects that were deliberately mediocre. A browser history filled with industry articles and harmless news sites. A sterile calendar of my work in the Pacific Northwest hub. It was a Potemkin village of data. My real work, the entire war room, was on a 256-gigabyte micro SD card, a sliver of plastic and silicon no bigger than my fingernail, currently nestled safely inside the hollowed-out plastic casing of the key fob for my beige, anonymous ghost car. With Sabine's legal attack neutralized, I turned my full attention to the B4 garage. The camera was my masterstroke. It wasn't just a dash cam. I'd sourced the components online: a wide-angle, low-light pinhole lens, a high-capacity lithium polymer battery pack, and a microtransmitter that used encrypted cellular data. My workshop was the back table of my anonymous apartment. I carefully drilled a hole into a temporary cardboard license plate, perfectly aligning it with one of the printed bolt holes. I seated the pinhole lens, making it invisible from more than a foot away. The battery and transmitter were secured to the back of the plate with high-strength epoxy. The final product looked like nothing more than a flimsy, dealer-issued template. During one of my late-night visits, I fixed it to the front of my ghost car, parked in its usual spot, B4. The lens had a perfect, clear, and unblinking view of the employee elevator doors. It had a 48-hour battery life. All I had to do was swap the plates every 2 days, and wait. The payoff came sooner than I expected. It was a Thursday night. I was monitoring the camera's live feed on a dedicated burner tablet. For hours, the feed was a still life of concrete and fluorescent hum. Then, at 10:13 p.m., the elevator doors slid open. Sabine emerged. She was alone, and she looked nervous, her head darting from side to side. She checked her watch. A minute later, a man emerged from the stairwell. He was aggressively nondescript. Gray suit, graying hair, a face you would forget a second after seeing it. He carried no briefcase. They exchanged no pleasantries. Sabine simply handed him a thick manila envelope. The camera's microphone was sensitive, but the garage's acoustics were terrible. Most of their conversation was a muddy, indecipherable murmur, but then, just before they parted, the man said something, and a few words cut through the static, clear as a bell. "Make the transfer to the Cressida Fund." Cressida Fund. The name was a lightning strike. It was a term I'd never seen in any of Halberd's financials, never heard whispered in any corridor. It was the missing variable. It was the key. I immediately went to work on the Greenwing emails. Tracing an IP address isn't the instantaneous, flashy process you see in movies. It's a slow, painstaking digital archaeology. I started with the headers from the original Greenwing funding proposals. The emails appeared to originate from a server in Delaware, a common tactic for legitimate corporations, but I peeled back the layers, following the email's path backward from server to server. It was routed through a proxy in Canada, then another in Panama. It was a deliberate, tangled web designed to hide its origin, but the architects of the web had made one mistake. The final proxy, the one meant to be the dead end, was sloppy. I found a vulnerability, a misconfigured port that allowed me to see the true originating IP address. It was registered to an address in rural, upstate New York. I ran a search. The address wasn't a data center or an office building. It belonged to the Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrows Church, a property that had been deconsecrated and abandoned for over a decade, a ghost address for a ghost company. But a cross-check of county property records revealed that the church and the land it sat on had been purchased 2 years prior by a holding company. That holding company was a subsidiary of a law firm based in the Cayman Islands, a firm notorious for specializing in discreet, offshore wealth management. Sabine wasn't just cheating on taxes. She was running a full-blown, international money laundering operation through a shell company disguised as an abandoned church. I had it all. The motive, the means, the method. I spent the next few hours compiling the evidence into a single, devastating package. I named the master file B4 Peak. It contained everything. The high-definition video of Sabine striking me in the garage, establishing her personal animosity, the video of the 10:13 p.m. meeting with the man in the suit, the crystal-clear audio of the name Cressida Fund, the complete set of ghost shipment manifests, and finally, a detailed network map I'd designed, a digital spiderweb that visually connected Halberd's accounts to Greenwing, Greenwing to the abandoned church, and the church to the offshore law firm. I encrypted the file and sent it to the minority shareholder's lawyer with no subject line and no message. The wait was excruciating. Every minute felt like an hour. I paced my small apartment, my mind racing. Had I missed something? Was it enough? Finally, a reply notification popped up on my screen. I opened it. The email contained a single sentence, a 6-word command that was colder and more thrilling than any praise. It read, "Continue to feign ignorance. Say nothing." The message was clear. The evidence was damning, and the plan was in motion. My role now was to be the quiet, unsuspecting victim, Following his unspoken instruction, I logged into the Halberd corporate network. I navigated to the executive board's shared calendar. With steady hands, I created a new event for the morning of the quarterly earnings call, a day when every single board member, investor, and analyst would be focused on the company. The meeting was titled, Urgent, Mandatory Disclosure of Material Risk. I invited the entire board of directors and the general counsel. I set the time for 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the earnings call was scheduled to begin. The bomb was set. The timer was ticking. That night, for the first time in a year, I felt a sense of calm. I took out a small, black moleskin notebook I kept, the only analog record of my entire plan. I turned to a fresh page, took out my blue pen, and wrote one final entry, a simple, declarative sentence to close the chapter of my silent war. It read, B4 began with violence. B4 will end with evidence. The call came the day before the earnings report. It wasn't a text, but my father's actual voice, a sound I hadn't heard directly in months. It was thin and reedy over the phone, stripped of its old resonance. Tessa, he said, and then a long pause. Meet me at Hangar 7. The old one. He hung up before I could reply. There was no need. It was a summons to the past, to the only place that was more his than it was hers. I walked across the vast expanse of tarmac, the afternoon sun glinting off the windows of the distant corporate tower. Hangar 7 stood apart from the modern, active facilities, a relic from my grandfather's era. Its corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust, and the huge, rolling doors were permanently locked halfway open, like a mouth that had started to speak and then thought better of it. The air inside was thick with the ghosts of old machines. It smelled of cold aluminum, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, sweet scent of oil that had seeped into the concrete floor over decades. In the center of the cavernous space sat the skeletal fuselage of a Halberd starfreighter, the first cargo plane my grandfather designed. It was a museum piece, a monument to a time when the company built things with its hands. My father was standing under its wing, staring up at a disconnected engine cowling, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked small in the vastness of the hangar. He didn't turn as I approached, my footsteps echoing in the silence. He just spoke to the dead engine. Don't fight her, Tessa. It wasn't an order. It was a plea, the weary request of a man who had already surrendered. You can't win. She has the board. She has the votes. It's over. I stopped a few feet away from him, the fuselage of the old plane between us like a beached whale. This isn't about winning votes. Dad, I said, my voice quiet but clear in the still air. This is about the company, the one Granddad built. I took a breath. Do you know what Green Wing is? For a long moment, he said nothing. He just continued to stare at the engine, as if it held the answer. Then, slowly, his gaze dropped from the plane, past me, all the way down to the scuffed toes of his own expensive leather shoes. He didn't have to say a word. The gesture was a confession in itself. He knew. Maybe he didn't know everything. Not the details I had uncovered. But he knew enough. He knew it was poison, and he had let it infect the company anyway. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the wind whistling through the gaps in the old hangar walls. Just as the silence became unbearable, a new sound joined the echoes, a quiet cough. Neither of us had heard him approach. Miles, my father's driver for the last 30 years, stood near the entrance. He was a man made of quiet angles and worn flannel, his face a roadmap of loyal service. He held 2 styrofoam cups in his hands. He walked over and handed one to me, then placed the other on a dusty workbench near my father. Figured you two could use some coffee, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't look at my father. His gaze was fixed on me. He took a slow sip from his own cup. Then, in that same quiet voice, he said, It's funny about this place. After 10 o'clock at night, you could park a tank at Pillar B4 in the corporate garage and no one would see it. Security patrol doesn't swing through that section until the morning shift comes on. He looked me straight in the eye. It was a statement delivered like a weather report, but it was a lightning bolt. He wasn't just making small talk. He was telling me he knew. He was telling me he was a watcher. He was telling me that things happened in the dark corners of the garage, and that he was the kind of man who noticed which corners were left unguarded. He was confirming, in his own deniable way, that he was an ally. I simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. My father, lost in his own world of shame, seemed not to have heard. Miles finished his coffee and crumpled the cup in his gnarled hand. "Rowan," he said, his voice a little louder now, "I'm going to check the tires on the car." My father just nodded, still staring at the floor. As Miles walked past me, his hand brushed against mine. I felt the cold, jagged edge of an old metal key being pressed into my palm. His fingers closed around mine for a second. "Old storage unit, back of the hangar," he murmured, so low I could barely hear it. "You should take a look." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the vastness. I curled my hand around the key, its teeth digging into my skin. I glanced at my father. He hadn't moved. I walked away from the silent confrontation under the airplane wing, toward the back of the hangar where a row of rusty metal doors lined the wall. The key fit the lock on the third door. It turned with a rusty shriek of protest. The storage unit was a time capsule. It was filled with old drafting tables, rolled-up blueprints, and the smell of dust and decaying paper, and on a metal shelf in the corner, there was a single, gray cardboard box. It wasn't sealed. I lifted the lid. Inside, it was filled not with machine parts or old manuals, but with files, manila folders, neatly labeled in my father's old, sharp handwriting. The dates on them were from 6 years ago, a year after he had married Sabine. My heart began to pound. I pulled out a folder. Inside were photocopies of wire transfer receipts, all to an unnamed fund in the Cayman Islands. Another folder contained printed-out emails, chains between Sabine and a lawyer I didn't recognize, discussing the formation of a sustainability-focused subsidiary. My father had highlighted certain phrases in yellow marker. Tax-advantaged, discrete asset allocation, minimal oversight. He had been tracking her from the very beginning. He had seen what she was. And then I found the last thing in the box, a single sheet of notepad paper, the kind he always kept on his desk. On it, in his own hand, were 5 words, written with a heavy, urgent pressure. "Don't trust the Green Fund." He had known, he had investigated, he had fought, in his own quiet way, until he couldn't fight anymore. This wasn't the evidence of a weak man. This was the evidence of a man who had lost a war I never even knew he was fighting. I closed the box, a cold, heavy sadness settling in my chest. I carried it back out into the main hangar. I placed the box on the workbench next to his untouched coffee. I didn't have to say anything. He looked at the box, then at me, and the last of his defenses crumbled. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, the sound of a weight finally being released. "I just wanted the company to survive. Tessa," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We were bleeding money after the 2008 crash. The markets were changing. She had a plan, a way to make us look modern, to get the environmental subsidies, a way to keep the doors open. I thought I could control it." I looked from his defeated face to the skeleton of my grandfather's airplane, and then back to the box of his own abandoned investigation. The pieces clicked into place, the weakness, the surrender. It wasn't just apathy, it was the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion of a man who knew he had made a deal with the devil and had been paying the price ever since. "Surviving isn't the same as eating yourself alive, Dad," I said, my voice softer now. "This isn't survival. This is a parasite, and it's killing the host." He had no answer for that. He just sank onto an old wooden crate, his head in his hands. A few minutes later, Miles returned. He walked past my father and stopped in front of me. He looked at the box, then at me, and a look of quiet understanding passed over his face. He pressed a thin plastic card into my hand. It was a temporary access keycard, the kind maintenance crews used. "Tonight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "2 a.m. The cargo elevator door on the loading dock will be open, the one that goes straight to the server room." He didn't need to say more. He was giving me the final key, the one that would let me into the castle keep. I nodded, clutching the card. I turned back to my father, who was still sitting with his head in his hands. I walked over to him and, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I put my hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch but didn't pull away. His shoulders felt frail beneath my hand. "It's okay, Dad," I said softly, the words tasting strange in my mouth. "I know. I'll take it from here." I squeezed his shoulder gently. "I'll do the dirty work so you can be clean." He looked up at me then, and in his faded, tired eyes, I saw not just defeat, but a flicker of something else, a glimmer of the man he used to be, a man who was now placing his last, desperate hope in the daughter he had tried to push away. The keycard Miles gave me felt like a shard of ice in my hand. At precisely 2:00 a.m., the sleeping world outside my window was a tapestry of dark blues and distant orange streetlights. I was parked a block away from the Halberd loading docks, dressed in dark, nondescript clothes, my heart a steady, cold drum against my ribs. The cargo elevator was exactly where he said it would be, its heavy steel door unlocked and opened just a crack. I slipped inside, the door closing behind me with a heavy, final thud. This was the point of no return. The server room was a sanctuary of cold, conditioned air and the low, unified hum of immense power. It smelled of ozone and clean electricity. I wasn't there to hack or to break anything. I was there as an archaeologist, to uncover the paper bones of a crime that had been meticulously buried under layers of digital sediment. I plugged my encrypted drive into a maintenance port on the main financial server. I had the questions. The machine had the answers. My first task was to perform a financial autopsy on Greenwing, to trace the flow of money with absolute precision. With my admin access, I pulled the complete, unredacted transaction logs. The first layer was simple, almost legitimate. I watched millions of dollars flow from Halberd's main operating accounts directly to the Greenwing initiative. Each transaction was dutifully labeled, "Carbon Offset Credit Purchase." It was a clean, plausible narrative designed to satisfy a cursory audit, but the money didn't stay in Greenwing's accounts. That was the second layer. The Greenwing account was merely a temporary holding pen. Within hours of receiving funds from Halberd, the exact same amounts were wired out, but they weren't buying carbon credits from any recognized environmental agency. They were being used to purchase high-yield corporate bonds, junk bonds. And the seller of these worthless bonds was an entity I knew all too well, the Cressida Fund. The connection I'd heard whispered in the B4 garage was now a hard, undeniable line item on a bank statement. Halberd was paying Greenwing for a service, and Greenwing was using that money to buy junk debt from Cressida. That was the third layer, the final turn of the screw. Where did the money go from the Cressida Fund? A fund, even one dealing in junk bonds, has to invest. Cressida's books showed one primary activity, issuing a single, massive, low-interest loan. It was a loan for over $80 million. The recipient was a registered LLC I'd never heard of, S. Hale Properties. The name sent a jolt of ice through my veins. S. Hale. It was audacious. It was arrogant. It was almost lazy. I dove into the state's corporate registry, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I pulled the incorporation documents for S. Hale Properties, LLC, and there it was, in the cold, black and white of a digitized PDF. The name of the sole registered officer, the person who had signed the documents, the owner of the entire enterprise, Sabine Hale. The S didn't stand for sustainable, it stood for Sabine. The entire convoluted scheme snapped into focus with brutal clarity. It was a perfect, self-sustaining circle of fraud. She was using her position to make Halberd pay her own shell company for a fake environmental service. That shell company then funneled the money through a hedge fund which, in turn, loaned the money right back to her, laundered and legitimized, to buy a personal real estate empire. I leaned back, the hum of the servers filling the silence. On my screen, I began to build a chart, a visual map of the relationships. It looked like a spider web. Halberd Aero Logistics was the struggling fly, caught and bleeding. The main strands of the web, Greenwing, Cressida, all led to the center, to a single, bloated spider, the final destination for the loan payments. The address listed on the S. Hale Properties documents was a private wealth management bank in the fictional and notoriously unregulated Kingswell Financial District. She had built her own private pipeline, siphoning the lifeblood of my family's company directly into her own offshore accounts. With the crime fully mapped, I needed to find the weapon. A corporate structure like Halberd is an organism, and every organism has an immune system, however dormant. I logged into the legal archives and pulled up the company's directors and officers' liability insurance policy, a dense, 100-page document that was the corporate equivalent of a last will and testament. I ran a search for specific phrases: malfeasance, fiduciary failure, criminal conduct, and there, on page 72, I found it. The clause was titled, Officer Fraud and Criminal Misconduct. It was unequivocal. If a corporate officer was found to have committed a deliberate act of fraud for personal enrichment, the insurance policy would cover the initial damages to the company, but only after the board took immediate action to remove the officer and claw back all illegally obtained assets. It was the guillotine. It gave the board, if they could be forced to use it, the legal and financial cover to sever Sabine from the company cleanly and completely. The digital trail was complete, but I needed to tie it to the physical world. I went back to my data on the waitlist shipments, the ghost flights. I selected a single flight from 3 months prior, HA899, a flight that had logged enough fuel consumption for a full load but a cargo manifest of 0. I then accessed the GPS logs for the ground transport truck that had supposedly delivered its cargo to the warehouse that day. The data was precise. The truck's transponder showed it arriving at the warehouse loading dock at 14:02. It remained stationary until 14:09. 7 minutes. It then departed the facility. It was a physical impossibility. Unloading a full cargo container from a semi-truck is a ballet of forklifts and manpower that takes hours, not minutes. 7 minutes was just enough time for the driver to get out, have a fraudulent bill of lading signed by a complicit warehouse manager, and leave. It was the real-world footprint of a digital ghost. Just as I was compiling these final pieces, my burner phone buzzed. A new message on the Danube 17 channel. It was another photograph, sent from a different anonymous source. The image was dark, clearly taken from a distance, but the subject was unmistakable. It was Sabine, in the passenger seat of a dark sedan, parked in the garage of a cheap-looking motel on the outskirts of the city. In the driver's seat, leaning toward her in intense conversation, was a man I recognized instantly, Arthur Vance, Halberd's former head of internal audit, the man who had taken an abrupt early retirement 6 months ago after he started asking questions about Greenwing's financials. This was a secret meeting between the Queen and one of her disposed-of courtiers, but my risk analyst brain didn't just see the people, it saw the details. I zoomed in on the car's license plate. It was a corporate fleet plate, but the prefix was wrong. It didn't belong to the main Halberd executive pool. I ran the plate through Halberd's comprehensive asset database, which included all its subsidiaries. A match came back in seconds. The vehicle was registered to Skyline Catering, a small airline catering company Halberd had acquired 8 years ago and largely forgotten about. Sabine was using an off-the-books ghost car, an untraceable asset from a forgotten corner of the empire, for her clandestine meetings. I had everything. I spent the next hour packaging the entire case into a single, heavily encrypted file: the financial autopsy, the spiderweb chart, the insurance policy's kill clause, the GPS logs, and the new photograph of Sabine with the disgraced auditor. It was a narrative of unimpeachable, cold, hard fact. I composed a new email to the aviation journalist, the one I didn't like but desperately needed. The email was short and to the point. Complete file attached. Everything you need is here. You have the exclusive, on one condition. You will not publish, post, or share any of it for exactly 48 hours. At 10:01 a.m., 2 days from now, the story is yours. I hit send. His reply came back in less than a minute. It was just as concise. Deal. Tentative headline is, The Green Wing That Never Flew. I read the words on my screen and, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of joy or happiness. It was a smile of cold, sharp, and profound satisfaction. The headline was perfect. It was elegant, brutal, and true. It was beautiful as a scalpel. The morning of the quarterly earnings call. The main atrium of the Halberd Tower felt like a surgical theater. The air was chilled to an uncomfortable degree, the white marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and the silence was punctuated only by the respectful low murmurs of analysts and investors. It was an atmosphere of sterile, high-stakes pressure. At the center of it all, on a brightly lit stage, was Sabine. She was wearing a brilliant white pantsuit, a stark statement of purity and power against the company's deep blue corporate branding. She was at the podium, speaking into the microphone with a calm, practiced confidence, her voice echoing smoothly through the cavernous space. And, as we look forward to the next quarter, she was saying, our commitment to transparency and robust corporate governance remains the bedrock of our strategy. We believe in delivering trust not just to our clients, but to our shareholders. I was sitting in the last row of the auditorium, a ghost in a simple gray dress, almost invisible in the sea of dark suits. I wasn't watching her. I was listening. A single, clear earpiece was tucked into my right ear, feeding me the audio from the live investor call, the unfiltered questions from Wall Street analysts, the disembodied voices that truly controlled the company's fate. I was a spectator in one theater, and the sole audience member in another. My entire plan was a machine with interlocking gears, and the time had come to engage the first one. My phone was resting on my lap, hidden from view. My thumb hovered over the screen. At exactly 9:27 a.m., I pressed send, a calendar invitation, marked with the highest level of urgency, shot through the Halberd servers to the private email accounts of the 9 members of the board of directors. The subject line was designed to be an electric shock. Urgent, mandatory disclosure of material risk. In the body of the invitation, a single sentence. A time-sensitive matter directly impacting compliance with SEC regulations requires the board's immediate review in the pre-briefing room. This matter must be addressed before 10:00 a.m. I had just lit a fuse. In the quiet, wood-paneled antechamber behind the stage, 9 phones would now be vibrating with a summons they could not legally ignore. On stage, Sabine was seamlessly transitioning to a slide about market expansion. Oblivious, she was a master performer, commanding her audience, completely unaware that a second, far more important, performance was about to begin backstage. The gears were turning. At 9:35 a.m., my burner phone, tucked in my pocket, vibrated once, a text message from the journalist. It was as blunt and sharp as he was. Clock is ticking. Tessa, we're prepped. 10:01 a.m. If I don't get a confirmation of internal action from you or your lawyer by then, the story goes live, no exceptions. A second fuse was lit, a hard deadline. The pressure was no longer just internal. It was now a loaded gun pressed against the temple of the company's public reputation. At 9:40 a.m., I saw Miles slip into the back of the auditorium. He caught my eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. I stood up and walked calmly to the exit, as if heading to the restroom. We met in the service corridor, the ambient sound of Sabine's presentation instantly muffled by the heavy doors. I didn't say a word. I simply pulled the USB drive from my pocket. It was a simple, black plastic rectangle, but it felt as heavy as a brick. It was labeled with a single, coded inscription, B4 Peak. He took it from me, his gnarled fingers closing around it. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. His expression was grim, steady. He was no longer just a driver. He was a soldier delivering the ammunition for the final battle. He turned and walked down the corridor, toward the private entrance to the boardroom's antechamber. I returned to my seat. In my earpiece, an analyst was asking a softball question about fuel cost hedging. I watched the clock on my phone. 9:45, 9:50, 9:54. On stage, Sabine was wrapping up her presentation, preparing to hand off to the CFO. She was smiling, confident, basking in the glow of the stage lights. At 9:55 a.m., the door to the antechamber, discreetly located to the side of the stage, opened. The board's prim, efficient secretary, a woman named Eleanor, stepped out and spoke to one of the stage managers. A moment later, the manager walked on stage and whispered something to Sabine. Her smile faltered for a microsecond, a flicker of annoyance. She excused herself from the podium. Her microphone switched off and walked toward the door, disappearing into the antechamber. The trap had been sprung. The quarry was inside. A moment later, Eleanor emerged again. Her eyes scanned the back of the auditorium, found me, and she gave a curt, beckoning gesture. This was it. I stood up and walked the length of the auditorium, the eyes of a few curious analysts following me. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope. Eleanor held the door for me. "The chairman has requested the head of risk to attend," she said, her voice a tight, professional whisper. The antechamber was a different world. The air was thick with tension. The 9 board members were all there, some standing, some sitting around the massive mahogany table. My father was among them, looking pale and drawn. Sabine was standing at the head of the table, her arms crossed, her face a mask of controlled fury. In the center of the table sat the B4 Peak USB drive. The chairman, Alistair Finch, a man with a mane of silver hair and eyes like chips of granite, was holding it between his thumb and forefinger. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice a low growl, "we have an extraordinary allegation here. Care to elaborate?" I didn't answer. I just looked at the large, high-definition screen on the wall. "Play the first file, please," I said. At 9:58 a.m., the screen flickered to life. The image was grainy, the timestamp in the corner clearly visible. It was the view from my hidden camera in the B4 garage. The room was silent as they watched the video of Sabine handing the manila envelope to the man in the suit. The audio was muddy, but one phrase came through with chilling clarity, echoing in the soundproofed room. "Make the transfer to the Cressida Fund." Sabine's face was as white as her suit. The color had drained from it completely. At exactly 10:00 a.m., I took my burner phone from my pocket and placed it face up on the table. I tapped the screen, activating the speakerphone on a call I had initiated seconds before. The voice of the journalist filled the room, calm and measured. "Coming up on the deadline, Tessa. You have 60 seconds. If I don't hear from you, we're running with it. 59, 58, 57. Alistair Finch's eyes widened. He understood immediately. This wasn't just an internal matter anymore. This was a public crisis. Seconds away from detonating, the countdown continued, each number a hammer blow in the silent room. 51, 50, 49. The chairman slammed his gold pen down on the table. The sharp crack made everyone flinch. He looked at Sabine, his face carved from stone. "There are 2 ways this goes," he said, his voice cutting through the journalist's countdown. "Choice 1. We go out on that stage right now and announce we have uncovered profound financial misconduct and are launching an immediate internal investigation. Effective now. We control the narrative. Choice 2. We do nothing. And in," he glanced at my phone, 35 seconds, he controls the narrative, and our stock price ceases to exist. The blood rushed back into Sabine's face, her expression a mixture of panic and defiant rage. She forced a laugh, a sharp, ugly sound. "This is absurd. This is a fabrication. Doctored footage from a disgruntled employee. You can't possibly." 30 seconds, the voice from the phone announced. I looked directly at Sabine, my voice cold and steady, cutting through hers. That was just the introduction, I said. We still have part 2. My words hung in the air of the antechamber, colder and heavier than the conditioned air. Part 2. Sabine's manufactured laugh died in her throat, replaced by a look of pure, venomous disbelief. The journalist's countdown had stopped, the line cut by the lawyer as soon as the chairman had spoken, but the echo of his voice remained. Alistair Finch, the chairman, turned his granite gaze from Sabine to me. "What part 2?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I ignored him for a moment, my eyes locked on Sabine. Her entire defense rested on a single, flimsy word: doctored. I would now take that word and break it over my knee. My stepmother claims the video is a fabrication, I said, my voice resonating with a calm that seemed to unnerve everyone in the room. That it was edited, manipulated. So, I suggest we go to a place where nothing can be edited, a place where reality is absolute. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Let's go back to B4. All of us, right now. The suggestion was so audacious, so theatrical, that for a moment, no one spoke. Sabine stared at me, a flicker of genuine panic finally breaking through her icy composure. She was losing control of the room, of the narrative, of her own fate. The company's lead counsel, Mark Ellison, who had been a silent statue until now, finally spoke up. "This is highly irregular," he began, but the chairman cut him off with a slice of his hand. "We are already in the land of the irregular. Mark." Finch grunted. He looked around the room at the other board members, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and a dawning, terrible understanding. "We will go, Ellison. You will accompany us, and get a videographer from the communications team. Everything from this point forward will be recorded on a clean, verified camera, with a continuous timestamp. We will create a record that cannot be disputed." The procession from the 40th floor antechamber down to the P4 sublevel of the garage was one of the strangest journeys of my life. It was a silent, funereal march, 10 board members, a panicked general counsel, a bewildered young man with a professional video camera hoisted on his shoulder, and me. Sabine was compelled to join us. Trapped by the momentum of the situation, she walked stiffly, a prisoner being escorted to her own execution. We rode the executive elevator down, the polished wood and soft lighting a surreal contrast to our grim destination. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. My father stood in the corner of the elevator, his face the color of ash, looking at no one. The elevator doors opened, and the atmosphere changed instantly. We stepped out into the familiar, subterranean chill of the garage. The air was heavy with the scent of cold concrete and the lingering ghost of exhaust fumes. The only light came from the long, humming neon tubes overhead, casting a sickly greenish-pale glow on everything. The opulent world of the boardroom felt a million miles away. Here, there was no polish, no pretense. There was only concrete, steel, and the dark, oily stains on the floor that looked like the dried blood of old machines. We walked in a loose group towards stall B4, our expensive leather shoes scuffing and echoing on the grimy floor. The videographer's light cut a sharp, white circle in the gloom, making the dust motes dance. We stopped in the space between the concrete pillar and the empty parking spot, the very ground where Sabine had assaulted me. It felt like returning to the scene of a crime, which, of course, it was. Sabine, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity in the chaos. She turned to me, her expression shifting in an instant from cold fury to one of deep, feigned concern. She put a hand on my arm, her touch a violation. "Tessa, my dear," she said, her voice a soft, conspiratorial whisper. "This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. Can we please just speak privately for a moment? Just the two of us." It was a classic maneuver. Isolate, manipulate, control. She wanted to pull me away from the audience of the board, to a place where she could apply pressure without witnesses. I looked at the lawyer, who gave a subtle shake of his head, but I had anticipated this. The videographer was not the only one recording. The lawyer's aide, before we left the antechamber, had clipped a tiny, powerful lapel microphone to the collar of my dress. It was live, feeding directly to a secure recorder in the lawyer's briefcase. I gave Sabine a small, tired nod. "Of course," I said. She led me a few steps away, positioning the concrete pillar between us and the rest of the group, creating the illusion of privacy. Her back was to them, but my face was in their full view. The videographer, following his instructions, kept the camera on both of us. Sabine's mask of concern dropped the second she thought we were out of earshot. Her voice was a low, urgent hiss. "All right, Tessa. This little drama of yours is over. What is your price? Name it. How much will it take for you to pack your bags and disappear from this company and our lives forever?" It was the question she had been born to ask, the only language she truly understood. Everything, to her, was a transaction. Loyalty, power, family, all of it had a price tag. As she spoke, I let my gaze drift up to the corner of the pillar, to the innocuous, dusty sprinkler head. I knew my own hidden camera was no longer there. I had retrieved it after its job was done, but I looked at the spot where it had been. I looked at the ghost of my silent witness. I brought my eyes back to hers. Her face was tense, expectant, waiting for the negotiation to begin. "It's not about a price," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still, heavy air. I knew the lapel mic would pick up every word. "There's no amount of money. I only want one thing." "What?" she snapped, impatient. "What is it?" "I want you to apologize to my father," I said. "I want you to stand here, in front of these people, and tell him you are sorry, on camera." For a moment, she just stared at me, her mind unable to process the demand. It was a currency she didn't possess. Then, she threw her head back and laughed. It was not a sound of amusement. It was a raw, ugly bark of disbelief and contempt. "Apologize? To him?" she sneered, her voice dripping with scorn. "That weak, pathetic man? You are more naive than I thought." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, a final, fatal act of hubris. "He signed every document. He approved every transfer. He signed everything because I made him sign it." It was the confession, the final, irrefutable nail. Not just an admission of the scheme, but an admission of coercion, of malice, of her utter contempt for the man she had used as a shield. Before I could even react, a new voice cut through the space. "That is quite enough." Mark Ellison, the general counsel, stepped out from behind the pillar. His face was pale, his professional composure shattered. He had heard every word. The board members behind him were frozen, their faces a gallery of shock and dawning horror. And then, another figure emerged from the deep shadows by the stairwell, stepping into the edge of the videographer's light. It was Miles. He stood there, his arms crossed, his expression as solid and immovable as the concrete around us. Ellison pointed a trembling finger at him. "And who is this?" I answered before Miles could. "This is the second witness," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He was standing right here, in the shadows, when she slammed her handbag into my shoulder and told me I would never touch this company. A collective gasp went through the board members. My father looked up, his eyes meeting Miles's, and in that shared look, years of silent observation and loyal witness were confirmed. The garage had fallen completely silent, save for the incessant hum of the lights overhead, the sound of the board members shifting their weight, the scuff of their shoes on the concrete seemed to echo with the finality of a gavel's strike. There were no more shadows for Sabine to hide in. There was nowhere left to run. The B4 garage, the place where she had committed her first, foolish act of physical violence, had now become a perfect, brutal mirror. Every lie she had told, every crime she had committed, was now reflected back at her in the unforgiving pale green light for the entire world to see. The elevator ride back to the 40th floor was a journey through a vacuum. The 10 of us who had descended into the garage's grime now ascended in a tomb of polished wood and utter silence. Sabine stood in the corner, ramrod straight, her face a blank canvas of shock, the white of her suit now looking less like a symbol of power and more like a shroud. No one looked at her, no one spoke. The air, once thick with tension, was now thin and brittle with undeniable, horrifying truth. The judgment had already been passed in the silence of the descent. All that remained was the sentencing. We didn't return to the antechamber. Chairman Finch led us directly into the main boardroom, a sanctum of power that had now been repurposed into a courtroom. He gave a curt order to his secretary, and a moment later, the vast, wall-mounted screen that usually displayed quarterly earnings charts was brought to life. It was split into 3 distinct panels. On the left, a video file was cued, B4 Garage Cam 1. In the center, a complex diagram glowed, the spiderweb I had built in the server room, its lines connecting Halberd to Greenwing, Greenwing to Cressida, and Cressida to a single, damning name, S. Hale Properties. On the right, a scanned PDF was displayed, a page of dense legal text. I recognized it immediately. Page 72 of the Directors and Officers Insurance Policy, with a single clause highlighted in glaring digital yellow. Officer fraud and criminal misconduct. The evidence was no longer an allegation whispered in a private room. It was a triptych of guilt, displayed for all to see. The minority shareholder's lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had been waiting for us, stood at the head of the table. He was not a showman. His voice was calm, dispassionate, and utterly lethal. He picked up a remote. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he began, his voice cutting through the silence. "What you have before you is a clear and irreconcilable breach of fiduciary duty." He clicked the remote, and the diagram in the center of the screen pulsed, the line flowing from Halberd to Sabine's shell company glowing a vibrant, accusatory red. This diagram illustrates a premeditated scheme to defraud this company of, by our initial estimates, more than $80 million through fraudulent invoices and a money laundering operation involving offshore entities. He clicked again. The document on the right filled the screen. As per the company's own D&O policy, which I have highlighted for you, the commission of a deliberate act of fraud for personal enrichment by a corporate officer triggers an immediate, non-negotiable protocol. He didn't need to read the fine print. He had memorized the kill shots. First, immediate termination of employment for cause. Second, the initiation of legal proceedings to claw back all misappropriated funds and assets. And third, mandatory reporting of the offense to the appropriate federal and state authorities. Each point landed like a hammer blow. Termination, asset seizure, criminal referral. It wasn't a negotiation. It was the methodical, procedural dismantling of a life. Sabine finally broke. The mask of composure shattered, and raw, incandescent fury took its place. She whirled on me, her eyes blazing. "You!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly tear in the fabric of the room's decorum. "You ungrateful little leech! After everything we did for you, everything this family gave you, this is how you repay us? By trying to tear down everything your father built?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I met her rage with a cold, quiet calm that was infinitely more powerful. "I am not tearing down what my father built," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm saving it. I chose to be loyal to the company. Sabine, not to your wallet." The words struck her silent, and in that silence, a new sound emerged, the scraping of a chair. My father, who had been a silent, ashen figure at the far end of the table, slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He was unsteady for a moment, but then he stood tall, taller than I had seen him stand in years. He looked directly at Alistair Finch. "Mr. Chairman," he said. His voice wasn't the weak, hesitant whisper I had grown used to. It was quiet, but it was firm. It did not tremble. Effective immediately, I am formally revoking the proxy and all powers of attorney previously granted to my wife, Sabine Hale, to act on my behalf in all corporate matters. It was a declaration of independence, a severing of the final cord that gave her any claim to legitimate power. It was the sound of a king reclaiming his throne, however late in the day. Alistair Finch nodded grimly. The motion is recognized and recorded. He looked around the table. A vote is now called for. All in favor of invoking the protocol as outlined by Mr. Thorne, termination, asset recovery, and criminal referral, a show of hands. Hands went up around the table. Sharp, decisive movements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I saw my father's hand. Held high and steady, Finch raised his own. "The motion passes," he declared, his voice devoid of emotion. 6-1. The execution was complete. At that exact moment, a shrill, piercing sound cut through the room. The old-fashioned telephone on the credenza, the one reserved for the board's private line, was ringing. Everyone stared at it. A strange intrusion from the outside world into their sealed chamber. Finch's secretary, looking flustered, answered it. She listened for a moment, her eyes wide, and then held the receiver out to me. "It's for you, Ms. Monroe, a journalist." I walked to the phone. I knew who it was. I looked at the board, at my father, and then I pressed the speaker button, placing the receiver down on the credenza. The journalist's sharp, impatient voice filled the room. "Tessa, what the hell is going on? My deadline was 10 minutes ago. I've got the story queued up. Do I run it or not?" I took a breath. "You can run it," I said calmly, "but you may want to add a new lead. The board has already acted." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a low whistle of appreciation. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "That changes things." I could almost hear the smile in his voice. New headline. Then, how about this? "The wing clipped itself." I couldn't help the small, grim smile that touched my own lips. "That works," I said, and hung up. Finch gestured to 2 members of the corporate security team who had been waiting discreetly by the door. "Please escort Ms. Hale from the premises," he said, his voice flat. Sabine didn't scream or fight. All the rage seemed to have drained out of her, leaving behind a cold, hollow core of hatred. The security guards flanked her, and she walked toward the door. She stopped as she passed me, her face pale, her eyes like chips of ice. "You'll be alone, Tessa," she whispered, her voice a final, venomous promise. "You've made sure of that." And then she was gone. The heavy boardroom door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing with a profound finality. I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the room pressing in on me. I turned and looked at my own reflection in the vast, darkened window that overlooked the city. I saw a woman standing straight, her shoulders back. I was alone in the reflection. It was true. But for the first time in years, I did not feel lonely. I felt whole. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. Miles was standing in the doorway, where he had been waiting silently. He met my gaze and gave a single, slow, respectful nod. Then, I felt another gaze on me. I turned and looked at my father. He was looking at me, really looking at me, as if for the first time. The fog had lifted from his eyes. The look he gave me was one of pain, of regret, but also of a fierce, dawning pride. It was the look of a pilot who, after flying through a terrifying storm, finally sees a clear, open runway stretching out before him. The walk from the boardroom was like surfacing from a deep-sea dive. The world rushed back in, muted and strange. We moved down the long, glass-walled corridor. My father and I, a few steps behind the scattering board members. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting our long shadows ahead of us, making us anonymous silhouettes against the blinding light. The others walked quickly, heads down, eager to escape the shared trauma of the room. to retreat to their own corners and process the collapse of the old regime. They gave us a wide berth, as if we were radioactive. In a way, we were the living evidence of the sickness that had been purged. We reached the main elevator bank. My father stopped. I stopped with him, watching as the remaining board members filed into a waiting car, the polished steel doors sliding shut, leaving the three of us, me, my father, and Miles, who had been waiting patiently by the entrance, alone in the vast, silent lobby. My father turned to me, the light from the atrium window catching the side of his face. He looked older than he had that morning, but the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet clarity. He slowly raised his hand, just as he had at the airport. It was the same gesture, an open palm, a slight, almost hesitant wave, but the meaning was entirely different. At the airport, it had been the wave of a stranger, a pained apology for a chasm he could not cross. This was not that. This was a wave that closed the distance. It was not a goodbye. It was not an apology. It was a simple, profound statement. I am here. I will stay. I gave him a small, acknowledging nod. The great, unsaid things between us, the years of silence, the weakness, the pain, did not need to be spoken, not now, perhaps not ever. The healing would begin in the silence. I'm going back down to B4 one last time, I said softly. He understood. He just nodded, his hand dropping back to his side. Miles will wait for you, he said. It was an offering of safety, of support, and I accepted it. The journey back down to the garage was a solitary one. I took the public elevator this time, a slow, humming descent into the concrete heart of the building. When the doors opened, the garage was just as I had left it, cold, still, and smelling of damp and gasoline. But it no longer felt menacing. The ghosts were gone. It was just a place, a collection of concrete and steel that had been the stage for a critical act in a long, painful play. I walked to stall B4, my footsteps the only sound. My beige sedan sat there, a humble, anonymous servant that had played its part perfectly. I knelt down at the front bumper, the cold of the floor seeping through the thin fabric of my dress. I took a small screwdriver from my bag, the same one I had used to install the device. With a few quick, practice turns, I loosened the screws holding the temporary license plate. I carefully detached the plate, turning it over in my hands. The pinhole lens looked up at me like a tiny black, unblinking eye, my silent partner, my unimpeachable witness. I gently disconnected the battery pack and the transmitter, the delicate wires coming free with a soft click. I placed the components into a small, velvet pouch and put them in my pocket. The war was over. The weapon was decommissioned. As I stood up, I felt a profound shift inside me. A deep, internal tension I had carried for so long that it had become a part of me, a tightly coiled spring in my chest, finally, completely, unspooled. For the first time in a year, I could feel my own heartbeat, and it was slow, steady, and calm, as if on cue. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was lit up with an official, company-wide broadcast email from the office of the chairman. The subject line was stark: immediate leadership transition. The body of the email was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism, all cold, sanitized language about ensuring compliance and fiduciary responsibility, about a unanimous board decision to part ways with Sabine Hale. Effective immediately, it was the public execution, delivered in the blandest prose imaginable. The silent coup was now a documented fact. I opened my messaging app and found the journalist's contact. He was likely already writing, hammering out the story that would detonate across the financial world in the morning. I typed a single, short sentence and sent it to him. Let the facts speak. There was nothing more to say. No victory lap, no gloating, no self-aggrandizing quotes. The evidence, the truth, the paper bones of the fake wing, they would tell the story more powerfully than I ever could. A cool evening breeze ghosted through the garage, a current of fresh air from the outside world making its way down the vehicle ramp. It carried the faint scent of distant rain and the low, constant hum of Northcrest, a city that suddenly felt alive again. I had been so focused on the silent, internal war that I had forgotten there was a world outside the walls of Halberd. I got into the old sedan, the door closing with a solid, unpretentious thud. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine started immediately, settling into a low, smooth idle. It sounded like a quiet, even breath. It had been a good and faithful servant. There was no need for a dramatic exit. There was no need for any more revenge. The machine I had built had done its work, and now it was time to turn it off. The company would heal. My father would heal. I would heal. I put the car in drive and pulled out of stall B4 for the last time. I drove slowly up the winding ramp, level by level, moving from the artificial neon gloom toward the light. As I reached the top, the last of the afternoon sun broke across the windshield. A brilliant, blinding wash of gold and orange. It made me squint, my eyes unaccustomed to such brightness. And in that light, a final thought settled in my mind, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. The wave my father had given me at the airport, the one that had felt like a final, painful goodbye, had been nothing of the sort. It wasn't the end. It was the signal. It was the starting gun. The end. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and let us know. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Feel free to share your thoughts on Tessa's journey as well. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting that hype button. It really helps the video get heard.